I am Dr. Bryan Paul, ACTA's Director of Alumni Advocacy and College Debates and Discourse Alliance Curricular Fellow. We have just had the privilege to engage with the ideas of the past that have influenced where we have come so far as a nation, not to mention as Western civilization. We are now going to have the opportunity to build upon those very ideas of the past to see how they continue to influence and in fact should influence our society today, especially in the realm of higher education. I should make a special note that ACTA's VP of Campus Partnerships, Doug Sprei, was originally slated to moderate this panel. Sadly, he couldn't be with us due to family health issues, and I know he is with us in spirit. Doug is actually the first person I met from ACTA. He and I worked together while I was a PhD candidate at the University of Missouri to bring Braver Angels debates to my classroom. Having directly experienced and utilized the CD&D Alliance's work, I can tell you that it could not be more relevant or needed than it is today. Together with Braver Angels and Bridge USA, ACTA has forged a program that teaches students to honor ideological diversity, foster civil discourse on college campuses, and cultivate student and faculty leaders to carry the movement forward. Braver Angels debates are not competitive or performative events. They are immersive and highly participatory, inviting everyone in the room to express themselves freely in a collective search for truth. And conducted in a light parliamentary format and chaired by trained experts, they teach students to express their views, frame persuasive arguments, listen deeply, and engage respectfully around the most challenging political and social issues dividing our nation today. Ultimately, these debates operate on Enlightenment values that guide and encourage participants to arrive at greater understanding of issues and each other. As Doug put it to me, the ethos of our program is to put a spark in those young people and get their engines running to be happy conversationalists with each other on issues going on in the world. And civil discourse is the ideal complement to civic education, helping students become engaged citizens who know how to compromise and live together in a liberal democracy. How tragic to see the opposite ethos prevailing on campuses today. Many of us here are all too familiar with the threats facing Enlightenment values in higher education. These threats compel us to ask and answer some serious questions. What role should higher education play in maintaining and extending the Enlightenment? How do we explain and address how higher education should play, or the role it should play, and how do we explain and address the new forms of censorship and illiberal campus policies we see? Building on the insightful remarks of our previous panelists, these next panelists, equally daring and wise, will consider these questions along with proactive ideas to refocus universities on the educational missions. Allow me to introduce them. Ilana Redstone is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Her research focuses on understanding the way that certainty drives the tendency to judge harshly, demonize, and dismiss people with whom we disagree. The fundamental problem behind political polarization, lack of civil discourse, and lack of viewpoint diversity. She is also faculty director of the Mill Institute at the newly formed University of Austin. The Institute works with educators to create classroom spaces where they can challenge settled thinking and explore contentious topics. Her book, The Certainty Trap, from Pitchstone Publishers, is forthcoming in 2024. She is also a co-author of Why We Disagree About Inequality, Social Justice versus Social Order, and Unassailable Ideas, How Unwritten Rules and Social Media Shape Discourse in American Higher Education. Her YouTube video series, Beyond Bigots and Snowflakes, has received thousands of views, and her work has been published in numerous media outlets, including the Washington Post, City Journal, Tablet, and the Chicago Tribune. Dr. Redstone received her PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. Pamela Paresky is a senior fellow at the Network Contagion Research Institute and an SNF visiting fellow at Johns Hopkins University's Agora Institute. Her project, previously such, Her project, Habits of a Free Mind, Psychology for Democracy and the Good Life, aims to develop a set of teachable habits necessary for engaging along lines of difference without feeling traumatized and without dehumanizing others. She is also the creator of A Year of Kindness, a research-based guided journal that encourages people to record daily acts of kindness and thoughts of gratitude. Dr. Paresky serves as a visiting senior research associate at the University of Chicago's Institute. Learning new things all around about the Enlightenment and our distinguished panelists, but yes, formerly was of the University of Chicago's Institute on the Formation of Knowledge and director of Aspen Center for Human Development. I will point out that perhaps something that has been very special to her and further galvanizing her work is that she was the leading researcher at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression at the time that Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt wrote their book, The Coddling of the American Mind, which continues to resonate with readers today. She has written extensively for Psychology Today, the New York Times, and other prestigious outlets. She received a BA in anthropology from Columbia University, an MA in clinical psychology from Pepperdine University, and an interdisciplinary PhD in human development and psychology from the University of Chicago. Molly McGrath is a professor of philosophy and director of the Center for Teaching Excellence at Assumption University. She works in phenomenology, social ontology, and political philosophy, with particular interest in Edmund Husserl, Aristotle, the classics of Plato, Thomas Aquinas, Montesquieu, among others. In 2021, Professor McGrath received the Michael O'Shea Presidential Award for Excellence in Teaching at Assumption's annual convocation in honor of her pedagogical excellence, academic rigor, and commitment to her students. She was especially recognized for her teaching method, referred to as a mutual journey between her and her students. Her work has appeared in many journals, including the International Journal of Philosophical Studies, Husserl Studies, and Law and Liberty. She regularly publishes short pieces analyzing film and TV shows from a philosophical perspective. She received a BA in political economy and philosophy from Mount St. Mary's College and an MA and PhD in philosophy from the Catholic University of America. And there you have it. 3 outstanding scholars, 1 scintillating discussion to come, undoubtedly. We will now hear prepared remarks from each panelist. Following our last speaker, we will transition to the audience Q&A. Please join me once again in welcoming and thanking our distinguished panelists.
All right, I'm going to stand. And I did not bring my phone, so if I start to monitor time, so if I start to ramble on, then someone can just, you can get the hook and pull me over. So I'm Ilana Redstone. I just want to thank ACTA for having me here and for the invitation. It's just a great opportunity to come here and be part of this event. So thank you for that. I'm going to come at this problem. The other thing I want to say is there is something interesting to note just about the gendered nature of these panels between the first and the second. I don't know what that is, but there's something interesting there. So I'm going to talk about the problem of certainty. And so the Certainty Trap book, which was sort of mentioned, that'll be out in the summer of 2024, which was actually incredibly difficult to get published. Who knew it was so hard to publish when you are an author with no track record with a trade press, who has no social media platform, and who is writing a book telling people to do something that they don't want to do. So it turns out that actually is kind of hard. And so the idea that censorship and illiberalism, the lack of viewpoint diversity, the sort of decline in civil discourse, you could throw into that list, a decline in social trust, a decline in trust in institutions. And I want to situate these within a larger problem. And so that problem is thinking about the link between certainty and one of the foundational assumptions that we need for democracy to work. So democracy is, I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, democracy is predicated on the idea that and self-governance is predicated on the idea that we see each other fundamentally as capable of reasonable thought. And if we decide that that is no longer the case, then we have some really talk about uncomfortable choices. One is democracy no longer the form of governance that we want? Hopefully that's not where we end up. The other is, it's time to sort of really examine how the people that disagree with us on whatever issue are thinking about how they came to the conclusions that they came to, right? So those are so that's kind of where I'm coming from. I do think that to a certain extent, higher education has gotten lost. I think that if we link it back to the comments that were to Michael Polyakov's comments earlier today, I think some of the survey data that he was talking about sort of attitudes towards DEI statements, attitudes towards, I can't remember some of the other things, self-censorship, sort of speech codes, all of these things. In my experience, when I talk to students, and I tend to I'm in a sociology department, so if you think higher education leans left, sociology, if you go any further left, you're going to fall off of something. So, and it's usually, I will say for whatever it's worth, it's usually, we don't have a particularly good gender balance in sociology, but it's very racially and ethically diverse, certainly far more racially and ethically diverse than this room, for example. So I do think that in my interactions with students, part of what they don't understand is this connection. Like if I say, well, offense should be, how should we treat people who are offended? Well, that should be a line that people don't cross. Okay, well, don't then tell me that what you're concerned about is political polarization, is the decline of discourse. You can't have it both ways. And so part of it, and so it's I do find a different level of openness once that connection is made and when they sort of get there on their own. So I want to start with the premise, and I'm trying to be mindful of time. I want to start with the premise that the things we care about the most are morally and ethically complex. This sounds fairly uncontroversial, and it sounds like something people would just generally agree with. For me, it's something that I grew up with. It's also from my own experience just as a Peace Corps volunteer in the late 90s. But if we start with that premise, that has some really specific implications, which is that as soon as we see something as less than complicated, when we see something as easy, when we see the answers as easy, when we see the people who disagree as racist, libtards, idiots, morons in some other way, it means we're missing something. It doesn't necessarily mean that those people aren't those things, but it means we're willing to ask ourselves, how do we know what we know, and what happens if we're wrong? Right, and so that's an enormous difference. So, and that's why when I talk about the problem of certainty, it's very much related to ideas of, for example, intellectual humility and curiosity. The difference is that it turns out we're actually not very good at recognizing when we lack intellectual humility, and by the time we realize that we lack it, we're sort of halfway there. And so what I'm saying is actually we need to pay attention to that sense that the answers are easy, that people who disagree with us are X, Y, and Z, and that's your cue to sort of examine examine your own thinking. So I'll say that the problem of certainty has two solutions. Sometimes when I talk about the problem of certainty, people get very nervous, especially in a crowd like this. They get very nervous and they think that I'm making a moral relativism argument that you can't really be sure of anything and we can't say this is good and we can't say this is bad. There's a very long answer to that question. The very short answer is that is in no way what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that the problem of certainty, which leads us to the demonization and the dismissal of people who disagree, has two solutions. One is recognizing fundamental uncertainty in the world, and that could be anything from, as Carol, I'm sure we'll talk about later, the distinction, what do we know about the relationship between gender and biology? What do we know about the causes of inequality? What do we know about the right immigration policy, right? So there's certainty on a very practical level. But the other way out of this, the other thing that certainty does is it teaches us, it lets us be very sloppy in our thinking, right? And so it lets us be very ambiguous and very unclear about what is the principle that's driving the disagreement. And so I'll just give you an example. It's the difference between saying, let's say I'm having a conversation with somebody who doesn't think that women should be allowed to drive. And maybe I'm not super excited about this. And so one way that I could disagree with this person, right, depending on my goal, one way is I could say, well, you're obviously a raging misogynist. right? This is right. Like that would be, and and nothing in what I'm saying is necessarily ruling that out. But another possibility, but I might be wrong. Like there may be other reasons, there may be other things going on. Another possibility is I can be very clear about what's being violated for me. So that might look like I think women should have equal rights under the law, or I think that everyone should have the right or the freedom to pursue their own economic potential, and I think that being allowed to drive is an important part of that. As long as I'm willing to have someone else question those principles, I'm not like the conversation can keep going. Right? And so that might look like, well, that's interesting. You think women should have equal rights under the law? Like, are there limits to that? What about the draft? Do you think women should be drafted? As long as I'm willing to sort of be questioned, unchallenged on that, the conversation can continue. And that's a very different place than where we are now. And it has very practical implications for how we talk about all of these issues in higher education. I can tell you that I talk about everything all the time with very, very liberal students, primarily. In fact, I wish I had more experience talking to conservative students, but they don't gravitate to sociology. And surprise. What I find is that if you leave the breadcrumbs close enough together, if you make this assumption, this will lead to this. If people, they'll get there on their own in a way that if I came in and just started railing about the importance of free speech or the importance of viewpoint diversity, these are the downstream consequences of this much bigger problem that we've forgotten how to make the connect. And we've forgotten sort of at an institutional level and at an individual level, forgotten how to make that connection. So I will stop there, and hopefully that is some useful advice.
Good morning. How's everybody doing? I have been better. I'm going to tell you a little. I went to the launch of the University of Chicago's new Forum for Free Inquiry and Expression, which was on October 5th and 6th. And on one panel, David French spoke about arguments for censoring. When we want to censor disfavored speech, there are different reasons we want to do it. And one reason is that it might lead people to believe things that are false, or things that are bad for them, or bad for society, or that people might become violent if persuaded by certain speech. So these are arguments for censorship that we can discuss, because the claim that as far as people who want to, defend the censorship, is that there's something that will happen as a result of the speech, and so we can talk about the speech itself. But there's a different kind of claim about the harms of speech that, as far as its defenders are concerned, is not open to disagreement, because that is the argument that speech itself denies or invalidates or erases people's identities, or is even a type of violence in and of itself. So talking about it, debating it, would be the harm, right? So according to this logic, not only should it be prohibited, but anyone using those prohibited words or expressing prohibited ideas should be canceled, right? And if that doesn't work, violence is acceptable. That's the speech is violence argument, right? We saw that in September of 2017 when in February of 2017, when Milo Yiannopoulos' scheduled talk at Berkeley was canceled because of a violent mob. And the students that engaged in it justified their violent response as self-defense. You can read their justifications in the Berkeley paper, where they said that it was a legitimate exercise of self-defense. Then we saw this argument again in September of 2017 when Ben Shapiro was scheduled to give a talk at Berkeley, and students were offered counseling services. The message to the students from the administration read in part, "We are deeply concerned about the impact some speakers may have on individuals' sense of safety and belonging." No one should be made to feel threatened or harassed simply because of who they are or for what they believe. And that was in response to Ben Shapiro coming to speak on campus, not in response to what we're seeing now. And many activities, they said, many activities are being planned by academic administrative units to affirm Berkeley's commitment to a deep understanding of how these challenging times impact our campus's diverse communities and climate. In response to Ben Shapiro speaking at the University of Chicago, not in response to chants of globalize the intifada. So anyway, this group is familiar with many examples of campus illiberalism, and so I'm only going to mention a few just to put things in sort of stark relief. We saw a widely mocked safe space created in response to a debate about rape culture. We saw a mob that came after Brett Weinstein for objecting to the call for all white people to not come to campus on a given day. We saw a professor investigated for having a conversation with her class about the movie title, I Am Not Your Negro, and the book version title, which didn't use the word Negro, because she mentioned the word in having the conversation about the different titles. Off campus, we saw the forced resignation of an accomplished New York Times science writer for mentioning the N-word and asking for details about how it was used. We saw the New York Times staff launch a social media campaign claiming that running a Tom Cotton op-ed about using the military to deal with the riots and looting of 2020 puts Black New York Times staff in danger. That was the publication of the article, not if the speech was persuasive, but the publication of the article itself puts the New York Times staff in danger. That resulted in the forced resignation of the New York Times opinion editor and others. So that's the background. And then on October 6th, when I returned to New York, where I now live, I got home, my plane landed about 11:30 at night, and my iPhone started buzzing, and it didn't stop buzzing for hours, because the app I had downloaded when I was in Israel earlier this year was sending me rocket alerts in rapid succession. 11:30 at night Eastern was 6:30 in the morning on Shabbat, October 7th, and the demonic brutality was beginning at that moment. It took one day to see vigils and demonstrations in support of an attempted genocide and the most depraved acts of terrorism perpetrated on Jews since the Holocaust, complete with signs reading "Glory to the Martyrs," if you haven't seen this. It took one day. So how did we get here? I would say that until relatively recently, the vast majority of Americans understood liberty and justice as universal moral goods, and we understood them in a certain way. There was a taken for granted acceptance of the imperative to stand firm for non-negotiable demands for human dignity. Among those demands, freedom of speech, the rule of law, and equality under the law, tolerance, respect for women and minorities, the right to private property, the importance of objectivity, and the limits of the power of the state. But there's a problem with taking any central moral claim for granted. And that is that while we might assume that our enemies don't share a moral code, the assumption of the centrality, or at least the acceptance of the same moral claims by one's allies, often goes unchallenged. And that is the challenge that we're seeing now. There's also the risk that those moral imperatives or absolutes or universals that we think our allies and our fellow citizens subscribe to, there's a risk that if we don't continue to talk about them, if we don't continue to teach them, that they fade into the background or they fade into oblivion. And when the North Star that guides our behavior interpretations is forgotten, then some other constellation can take its place. So now we get to this point where, however wrong-headed most Jews and others who stood in solidarity with groups like Black Lives Matter and Students for Justice in Palestine, which is the most effective promoter of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, they likely did so in the spirit of defending at least many of those moral non-negotiables, thinking that those were shared. And those who failed to vocally object to the tenets of those groups either remained silent out of a mistaken assumption that those moral imperatives were shared by all, or by a fear that saying the wrong thing would result in them being, excoriated, canceled, etc. So what's become clear, at least to some of them now, is that the people who lead these groups, at least, and an unknown proportion of their members, do not, in fact, share those those elements of our moral compass. And what has happened instead is the replacement of an Enlightenment paradigm with a paradigm in which the locus of virtue is not the individual, but the perceived powerlessness of groups. The paradigm is infused with narratives of appropriation, privilege, greed, and hidden power. These are thinly veiled anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. But whiteness, rather than Jewishness, is the villain and the locus of power, and most Jews are then made white. And then the morality of an action, especially on campus, this paradigm says, or the people on campus are especially likely to subscribe to this moral paradigm, that the morality of an action is now a function of the relative perceived power of the actor's group identity and the relationship between the actor and the person being acted on. In this new paradigm, that means it's only the number of casualties that matters, because that's what indicates relative power. This is a paradigm that divorces intention from impact. I'm sure you've seen on Canvas, it's impact, not intent, that matters. And you can see now what the direct thread is to being able to say that it doesn't matter that one faction intends for civilians to be killed and the other intends to spare civilians' lives, because intention doesn't matter, only impact. So the numbers of casualties is all that matters. It leads to the moral inversion of claiming that when Hamas refuses to allow Palestinian civilians to seek shelter or to evacuate, when the IDF warns of future bombing campaigns, it's Israel, not Hamas, that's guilty of war crimes. And it leads to defending the most barbaric war crimes, horrors intentionally inflicted on Jews and other Israelis, while holding Israel responsible, not just for its campaign of bombing, but for those war crimes committed by Hamas. So I'll just close by saying that today, the people who once believed that the BDS movement and various other ancillary movements represented a legitimate critique of Israel's policies, and that the Black Lives Matter movement was a movement that truly cared about justice and fairness, as those things are conceived in a pluralist liberal democracy, are faced with a moral reckoning as they watch these movements explicitly call the massacre, rape, torture, and kidnapping of civilians, as I'm going to use the words they use, reasonable, justified, and heroic. Okay? People are even tearing down posters of kidnapped hostages. This is unvarnished anti-Semitism, and it's anti-civilization. It's inhumane, and it's being dismissed as political speech. From the river to the sea is a call for the ethnic cleansing of Jews at best and a complete genocide at worst. Globalize the Intifada is less ambiguous. And the chant, there's only one solution, is pretty chilling. This is an era in which students have learned that saying America is a melting pot is a microaggression. A debate about rape culture requires a safe space. And the phrase, all lives matter, is offensive. It's so offensive that people just don't say it anymore. But calling for the genocide of Jews and celebrating the terrorists who raped children to the point of breaking their pelvises, slaughtered families in their beds, shot children in the face, and tortured them until they begged to be killed, and kidnapped over 200 people of all ages is the moral thing to do. Celebrating that is the moral thing to do on campus. So let's be crystal clear about it. The genocide of Jews was always a political thing. It was the aim of a political program. Even the term anti-Semitism was a political program. And now, in response to Jewish students expressing their legitimate fear for their safety, as members of their own campuses, their own peers, aided and abetted by professors and administrators, openly declare their support for terrorism that targets Jews, these same institutions that created the safe spaces and trained them in microaggressions and have been offering trigger warnings suddenly and miraculously become staunch defenders of freedom of speech, which I support. I support this pivot, but the timing is really something. Our democracy is profoundly unwell, and we see this most on college campuses. And all I can say at this moment is at least the masks are off. And it's up to us in this room what happens next.
Your talk is very different. Thank you for that, Pam. And I feel silly saying these things now, but we'll see what you think. So I just want to notice a pattern on universities in the United States. Universities like to flatter their students by telling students they should change the world and that university education gives them tools to do so. The tools given are various. Some are bourgeois, pre-professional skills in accounting or nursing, for example, preparing people for middle-class employment in contemporary capitalism. Other tools are more Enlightenment, the Baconian Cartesian sciences, natural and social, that make the world our workshop, producing technology and medicine and scientifically backed policy. The humanities are a bit demoralized in this context, as they don't measure up to the sciences or the professions in exactness or usefulness. But they have conformed, joining the social sciences to develop tools to train students to try to change the social world. This isn't all that happens in the humanities, mind you. It's just what happens often today when humanities convince themselves that to educate is to prepare students to transform the world. What are the tools the humanists offer? One is postmodernism, which unmasks claims of reason and truth as weapons for domination. Its sophistic tricks can be quickly learned by sharp students to be wielded against whomever they wish to knock down a peg. It can also be wielded against any argument or evidence one doesn't like. It functions as a kind of inoculation against the self-critical capacity of reason. One of the things that makes me crazy is talk about critical reasoning as the main skill that college is supposed to teach. But the main thing is that it's supposed to be self-critical reasoning. And critical reasoning is actually really cheap and easy to teach. Another tool is a derivative of a deracinated Marxism, especially as reflected in identity politics and decolonial theory, and blended with pious impulses. This tool has been developed interdisciplinarily between the humanities and the social sciences. It prepackages for students a structure for narratives in which demographic groups seek recognition as peoples who have been oppressed and who should unite for their liberation against the occupiers, while other demographic groups are cast as oppressors. This narrative can be adopted by all groups, some more convincingly than others. These two tools are often used in tandem explicitly against the Enlightenment. Certain claims to objective truth or reason are selectively attacked as oppressive and authoritarian, and trauma is then deployed to grant an exalted social status, a sacred status to some political positions, and a forbidden status to other political positions. The sacred status of some claims and some traumas, again, act as a kind of inoculation. It is blasphemous to present counter-evidence. There are enough people on most campuses, not only faculty, but also students, administrators, and staff, trained in this praxis, this blend of theory and revolutionary action, to provide institutional support for censorship and other illiberal campus policies. And by trained, I mean explicitly, in classes sometimes, but also in workshops and seminars and mandatory HR certifications, places we might find the privilege walk or the invisible knapsack or the canonical memo explaining microaggressions. Though anti-enlightenment in profound ways, this phenomenon in the humanities and social sciences fits in with some other aspects of the modern Enlightenment. Namely, the university is used to produce a class of people who think of themselves as the enlightened and who are eager to use reason instrumentally to remake the world. Paulo Freire, in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, has a remarkable line that blends the oppression narrative with the Baconian Enlightenment ideal. In Genuine Dialogue, he says, between the oppressed and their pedagogues, that is the revolutionary leaders, because you don't have genuine dialogue with the oppressors. So in genuine dialogue between the oppressed and their leaders, neither party dominates. Rather, he says, together they dominate nature to produce liberation. As an aside, let me add that a great deal of traditional intellectual work continues to happen in the humanities that isn't described here. The large majority of people who go into the humanities join up because they like reading and thinking and are dedicated to the traditional standards of their disciplines. They mostly just want to spend their career engaging in the life of the mind and sharing it with young people. The upshot is that in selling tools to students to transform the world, many universities express a mishmash of Enlightenment and anti-Enlightenment assumptions. Thus, universities with research and development budgets buttressed by government grants and capitalist philanthropists, universities most of whose students are young bourgeois buying job credentials. These universities train activists in grandiose condemnations of the historical accomplishments and political and economic systems underwriting them. These universities often make official statements condemning the whisper of contrary opinions and promising counseling to those who have suffered trauma by hearing about such contrary opinions. The theory defending this praxis comes out of the humanities and is codified by some social sciences. The other power centers in the university, the hard sciences and the pre-professional disciplines, the people running the customer service and business sides of the institutions, they don't have the intellectual or spiritual resources to resist these anti-Enlightenment impulses within the university itself. These forces within the academy also have influence outside the academy, and it's become pretty mainstream. Predictably, obeying Newton's third law, there have been reactionary polarized mirror image responses, equally and oppositely dangerous, I would say, responses outside and against the academy. Unfortunately, until the Enlightenment comes for your own research or the books on your side of the library, for most academics, you don't care. My simple point is just that many universities are an incoherent mishmash of pro and anti-Enlightenment impulses. People are so concerned with their parts of the university, their own fields and offices, that no one prioritizes the coherence of the whole or the academic and philosophical values that are supposed to undergird the whole and keep it all together. This is partly because the research university and the disciplines that make it up are not reflective about what education is. This is why when universities speak of education in their advertising, the pathetic best they can do is promise to give their customer students tools to transform the world. The Enlightenment is not something that can be maintained unless it is extended. One of the charges to the panel was to talk about how to maintain and extend the Enlightenment in the academy. And I want to say it cannot be maintained without being extended. First, note that the modern Enlightenment is itself not monolithic. In addition to that, there are many periods, even within Western intellectual history, worthy of being called Enlightenments, the 13th century, for example, though I had personally emphasized the Greek Enlightenment, and more specifically, the Socratic Enlightenment. The core Enlightenment value is, I think, the commitment to reason. The problem with speaking of the Enlightenment, in the singular, is that it implicitly exalts that one age's understanding of reason as paradigm. And despite the variety within the modern Enlightenment itself, it turns out that what we have inherited as the Enlightenment's view of reason is too narrow and too static. Empirico-mathematical reasoning primarily aimed instrumentally towards remaking the world. And this understanding is not enough. Namely, it cannot defend itself because its defense requires a use of reason that isn't merely empirico-mathematical or instrumental. Empirico-mathematical reasoning sometimes thinks it just is reason, the whole of how reason operates, and on its own it simply cannot address the critiques of reason from the anti-Enlightenment wing of the humanities. People dedicated in the university to empirico-mathematical and instrumental reasoning often don't even see the tensions and contradictions. They are trained to use reason in their fields, but not to think about reason in general. They tend to respect, in an apathetic way, these anti-Enlightenment impulses from their colleagues, seeing them as merely different humanistic forms of enlightened expertise. They don't even see what's happening as an attack on what they believe in as reason. An extended enlightenment with a broadened sense of reason could more effectively renew liberal education. Now, there are worse things in the world, of course, than advertising to train students to transform the world. But I'd like to point out the distance between this and the idea of liberal education. This is my key point. A liberal education has the guts to tell students that they need to be transformed.
Excellent.
It doesn't flatter them that they are fully developed and need only to be empowered so that they can change everything but themselves. Rather, in liberal education, it is the person that is transformed, and it is reason operating in an intersubjective communal mode that transforms the person. That reason is, in part, the empirico-mathematical and instrumental reasoning, now seen as characteristic of the modern Enlightenment. But more than this, the reason that transforms the person in liberal education is also the same reason that the Socratic Enlightenment emphasized. More precisely, liberal education draws out and habituates the person's capacity for self-critique, so that the person transforms him or herself. In fact, and this is a crucial point I want to underline, the human person in genuine liberal education takes on a commitment to reason that transforms the person and even transforms the person's understanding of reason. For the concept of reason does not remain static as the person and the person's understanding of the world change. Instead, one looks back after years in education and sees that the concept of reason to which one first dedicated oneself is now wholly inadequate, superficial. Liberal education is a development of human potential, a development of personhood itself, including how the person reasons and what the person recognizes as reasonable. It is not merely an empowering of a person who is already fully developed. It is not merely data plus calculation utilized to remake the world. It involves the development of judgment, of the capacity to weigh different modes of evidence, to consider serious human concerns, to search for the genuinely true and good in admission that none of us already possess the true and good adequately. It involves the ability to listen to other people's ideas and their reasons and evidence about the just and unjust, good and bad, noble and base. Those are habits that the humanities are best suited to develop and that are needed to complement the progress that the STEM fields continue to make. For new technology and new information are no use to us without people able to understand, to question, to deploy, and to use them well. But the humanities, demoralized, no longer sees this. Education of the person as their primary job. Instead, they mimic the research focus of the sciences and the training for action focus of the professions. One of the problems with any enlightenment is the enlightened. Those people with a rather narrow view of reason and the idea that they and not their opponents possess the whole of reason. But reason is a dynamic capacity, and no person and no age can both commit itself to that capacity and contain it. Those defending the values of the Enlightenment must not presume to be enlightened, but must face reason as an ideal that continues to require them to critique and renew themselves. What education trains us to change, and change again and again as we get older, is us. The panel was also asked to make some kind of proactive, very, action item-y suggestions. So what steps should universities today take to maintain and extend the Enlightenment? I would say 4 things. First, defenders of the modern Enlightenment need to renew their connection to the Socratic Enlightenment. 2, universities should specifically aim to convince students to commit themselves to reason as the alternative to ideological and identitarian allegiances, while at the same time challenging the assumption that empirico-mathematical reason is the paradigmatic case of it. Rather, we need to showcase the reason that exercises good judgment and can discern what is best in bad circumstances, and the reason that can turn inward and wonder what it's missing that others might see. 3, we need to remoralize the humanities by affirming that their central job is liberal education, not their majors, not research, and not training for either graduate school or revolutionary action.
What's the difference?
And finally, universities should not be in the business of flattering students that we will empower them to change the world. Genuine reason is a capacity of self-transformation. Have the guts to tell students that before they can improve the world, they must first improve themselves.
I would give you a standing ovation for that.
Thank you very much, all 3 of you, for your scintillating thoughts, and I think all of us couldn't agree more that those in higher ed could definitely be using some more guts right now. And I see that we already have hands flying up, so without further delay, let's get right to the Q&A. I will just simply ask that you keep your questions truly to questions so that we have enough time to get to as many people as possible before our time is up. Yes?
So, as genocide and torture have been openly celebrated on campus over the last 2 weeks, I have seen for the first time in the 20 years I've been doing this, some genuine cracks in the armor. And I'm wondering how you think we can capitalize, people who were like, oh wait, I didn't realize that this philosophy actually leads to support for rape and genocide. And so I feel like we have an opportunity to capitalize on this moment to show that it's this whole way of thinking. It's not just the anti-Semitic piece. I feel like there's perhaps a unique window of opportunity that might close, and I'm wondering how you think we might be able to capitalize on the fact that there are people who are actually questioning for the first time.
Do you want to handle that first?
All I will say is that it struck me that the 3 of us were talking about 3 aspects of the same problem, in that, Molly, you were talking about the sort of structure of the problem being the focus on tools for changing the world, rather than a self-reflective, first starting with an understanding that these are not fully formed human beings. When they set foot on campus, they're not fully morally formed. And this paradigm it creates an expectation that they see themselves and each other as fully morally formed human beings when they set foot on campus, and therefore if they say or do anything outside, if they cross a line, they are forever condemned. And one has to be absolutely certain, to your point, of the rightness of your ideas and your views, et cetera, to be an activist. In that realm, you're saying, I'm right, this thing is right, everybody who opposes me is wrong, and they're gathering allies in a structure of trying to change the world because there's something wrong about the world that they know. And there's no intellectual humility whatsoever about maybe having a conversation about, can we work with the people that we're seeing as in opposition with us? And so you're talking about how we do that. There's some really good tools for creating a little space for intellectual humility and uncertainty. And I'm pointing to what the danger is, and like the end point of not doing what you're doing and what you've pointed out. So I just wanted to sort of say that I was struck by even though our talks were very different, that they were really talking about the same problem. And I don't have an answer right now. I would love to hear what you're thinking from your different perspectives about where we can like shove something into that crack and widen it open.
I don't have a lot to say here that's insightful, other than it's just remarkable how what I've been complaining about, this kind of sacred victim thing that then justifies, like there's sacred positions and then forbidden positions. How that because the word colonizer is applied to the Jews, that all of a sudden it means that it's okay to do X, Y, and Z because they're the colonizer. And so this is showing up directly in just really explicit dehumanization, right? And so I guess for me, I would just want to point out that one of the reasons that, so there's this old-fashioned anti-Semitism, which is probably more characteristic of the right. And then the people on the left are real suckers for what's going on here because of the particular narrative that they've been taught in HR seminars and all these courses about decolonization and victimhood, and so that they just kind of buy it hook, line, and sinker, and then they're unable to recognize that calling a baby a settler is not a reason to kill it, And it's just really remarkable to me. I don't know whether I have any idea that we can hope that these are cracks in the armor, but it's certainly more explicit in the last couple of weeks than it's ever been. It's more public. It's more obvious that the end point of this tool that humanities and social scientists, again, a minority of people in those fields, but that they're teaching to some students to make them revolutionaries, that the end point of that tool is murder.
And to that point about the name, the label, the tactic of tearing down the hostage posters has changed in the past couple of days to putting a sticker over the top part that says hostage and replacing it with the word colonizer. So all they're doing is change, and because in the minds of the people who are doing that, the rest of what's on there changes. The fact that they were 7 years old, the fact that they've been taken, and et cetera, the way that you interpret it completely changes if they're a colonizer versus a hostage. It's a war of words.
So every fall I teach a course called Social Problems, which is usually domestically focused, but it seemed ridiculous at this point to teach a course on social problems and not talk about this massive social problem in the Middle East. And so, but I guess I would start by saying that this, for me, this topic, I would say up until about probably maybe a year ago or a year and a half ago, it was probably the one thing of everything that I was like, I'm not sure how to touch it. Like, I don't even know. Like, and then actually I wrote a piece for Sapir. They asked me to write a piece and I was like, okay, screw it. Like, I'm just gonna try and figure it out. And so, I don't mean to figure it out as putting it too strongly, but I will say that to your question about, is there sort of a crack or can you get your foot in the door or whatever the right metaphor is, we're now 10 weeks into the semester and I've been talking to students. So what I was saying during my comments about if you assume that the things we care about the most are morally and ethically complex, that is a way into this in the sense that if you think this is simple, like you're missing something. So generate how many questions, so in a practical sense, how many questions can you generate that would sort of destabilize how simple you think this might be? And a bunch of these are in the Sapir article, but like things like, what is the right way to accommodate a people who have been wronged? What is, can a group be oppressor and victim at the same time? Right? Whatever, and there's a whole, there's something magical about my list of questions, but if you think that things are simple, and so now we're 10 weeks into the semester where they've been listening to me talk about this, and I can come into that conversation in a very different way than me trying to bludgeon them with something, because they're getting there on their own, right, okay, yeah, I see sort of how this connects. So I don't know. But that's 45 students out of, I don't know, how many.
Every student counts.
Yeah. Yes, every student counts.
Let's see here. Let's go into the over here on this side, gentleman in the blue suit and tie.
We've actually been discussing this topic at length at Chapel Hill. I'm on the Board of Trustees there. And we've sent lots of emails back and forth about free speech and what that means right now. And so my questions would be, when you talk about free speech and what's not free speech, what's not allowed, you've got inciting violence, true threats, obscenity, fighting words. And I feel like we've crossed that line. But there's been so much victimization and people claiming that any sort of other speech is violence that I think it gets lost. I'm worried that sometimes in trying to understand the other side, we take too long to respond on these things. So my questions would be, what speech should not be protected? And how do you objectively spot it? And what do you do to de-escalate or worry about your steps that could escalate and put students at risk? And then in terms of masks, how do you balance health versus hoods, which is where a lot of the masks aren't allowed to shield someone's identity, and we're seeing that on campus. So really just how do you spot the line on free speech and how do you handle masks?
So are you saying that when students are protesting, they're wearing masks that are ostensibly for protecting them from COVID, but they're using them to hide their identities?
It's exactly what's happening. And they're violating North Carolina law when they do that, but they can claim that it's a health reason.
Well, first of all, I want to introduce you to Samantha, the first question asker. She's a legal scholar of free speech law, so you can talk to her afterwards.
I will point out, if I may, with Chair's prerogative, Pamela, you recently penned an article with Nadine Straussen for the Free Press.
I did.
And maybe you could speak to that quickly, your experience writing that and what you wrote in there, because while I don't claim to be a legal scholar, but as I understand it from reading that piece and understanding the literature I've seen so far, there are relatively few restrictions on free speech from a First Amendment perspective, yes.
That's right, yeah. So the piece that Nadine Straussen, Nadine was a past president of the ACLU, and she's we're now going to call her generation of ACLU lawyers the Skokie generation. So you know where she stands on free speech. And so we wrote for the Free Press a piece that they titled something like "Even Anti-Semites Deserve Free Speech." I don't think I would have used the word "deserve" in the title, but they do have free speech rights. Because we all do. And in our country, our free speech rights are very, very robust. And I understand UNC Chapel Hill is a public university, so it doesn't have as much leeway as a private college does. And this is why I also suggest that you talk to Samantha, because she's, I can opine, but I might be wrong legally. But I can say that what we wrote, and Nadine and I are working on another piece for another publication about things that do cross the line. And some things that do cross the line, for example, are tearing down posters. So if you have a place where posters are allowed to be put up, then tearing it down interferes with the speech rights of the people who put it up. It's also vandalism if you are tearing down something that's supposed to be up. So there are non-really speech-related ways to deal with things too. There's recently I saw that there was a demonstration at Cooper Union in New York, and the demonstration was supposed to be outside, and they went into the library, and the Jewish students were locked in the library by the librarians, and the demonstrators tried to get in. They were banging on the door. And I just recently saw that the police said that was not a violation. I don't quite understand why that wouldn't have been, because they passed a security guard who said, no, stop, and they kept going. The permission they had for the demonstration was for it to be inside, not even in the library in the first place. So I'm not really sure what that's about. But certainly, it was a violation of what the school said. And I don't know, again, what the limits are there. But there are some things that, colleges can do because they also have to provide a climate, an environment in which students can learn. And so if the demonstrations are degrading that environment, if they're making it impossible for students to learn, then I think that probably is something that can be discussed in some way. I still defer to Samantha.
Any thoughts from our other panelists on that question? Not, we can go ahead. Gentleman in the middle here with the glasses.
I was wondering about institutional neutrality as a tool to get around this. It seems all of the pro-Hamas demonstrators are really targeting the president and the university, trying to force the president to make a pronunciation of the correct answer. And if these people had to convince their classmates one-on-one, they obviously would realize that their line of reasoning would not work in being persuasive. Yet by putting political pressure on a president and forcing the president to presumably bully everybody into that point of view, they feel they have a viable solution. So is institutional neutrality a way around the problem we're facing?
Certainly seems like Steve McGuire had mentioned earlier, all of a sudden, in a board meeting, it seems all of a sudden university presidents and administrators have found religion, so to speak, when it comes to institutional neutrality on this particular issue. You mentioned, Pamela, the timing of it is truly something. But yes, thoughts from the panel about institutional neutrality. How might that be something that could help us with Enlightenment values?
I mean, I think that yes, it seems obvious that institutional neutrality would be a good, I was talking to, a couple of days ago, I was talking with a graduate student in the sociology department, and she is an American Muslim. She's born in, I think she's actually from DC. And so I was talking to her, and I was really talking to her about, she was doing some grading for me, but then I was asking her about sort of what her impression was about, I was just curious, what her impression was about sort of how things were being handled on campus. This is at the University of Illinois. And her perspective was that she was very frustrated by the statements that were coming out from the administration. And the University of Illinois is, it's not much different than any other institution you would find in this respect. And she was saying how she was very frustrated because she felt like there was a lot of sympathy for the Israeli lives that were lost, and there was not a lot of sympathy for the Palestinian lives. So I'm just saying this is what she was telling me. And going back to the question about institutional neutrality, so one of the examples that she gave is she was talking about how some of her friends on campus who were Turkish students back in February when there was the earthquake, they wanted a statement about, I'm not sure exactly what, but something about sympathy, because obviously that's a natural disaster, not a political moment. But although I suppose they're related, but in terms of the response. But she was saying how the students were trying to get a statement from the administration then. I didn't know about this, but she knew about it because these were people who were friends of hers. And so she was saying how the administration said, we don't comment on world affairs. Now, is that true? I have no idea. But if that's true, obviously that's absurd, right? They make comments all the time about statements about everything. And so her solution to that, she was like, well, they should come out with a statement about that there are innocent Palestinian lives being lost as well. And I was like, you will never win the game of trying to make a statement for everybody. Never. You will never win that game. And so just stepping back. So in terms of institutional neutrality, and now I will say, and I'll stop in a second, I think there are separate pieces. I think there's sort of the obvious piece of not making statements and sort of because you're declaring, at least not doing it without sort of a real clarity about the principle, what the principles are so that they can be applied consistently. But I think better is to just not make statements. But that doesn't mean that doesn't mean you can't say anything. You can sort of encourage people to get at the questions and the sort of complexity and understanding. And then the last thing I would say is that the loss of neutrality, this piece about certainty, there's one thing to sort of lose neutrality and know that you're losing it. I'm not sure that institutions that have made mandatory DEI statements mandatory, I'm not sure that they would consider that to be a loss of neutrality, but it is. Right, and so it's woven into the fabric of the university in a way that makes it a lot harder to pull back from.
I just like to say, just to make this more concrete, neutrality about what? That is to say, what level of neutrality and neutrality about what? I think it's like just oxymoronic to say that an institution is going to be neutral, for example, morally neutral, like to core, right? Just completely across the board. Because to be an institution is to be dedicated to certain activities together, and that requires that we're assuming that there are certain goals that we take as good and certain habits that are going to undergird our ability to pursue those goals together. And an institution can't be neutral at that level. And this is one of the problems, is that mathematico-empirical reasoning can't justify the goods that an institution is seeking or the virtues that it's going to need in order to seek those goods. So you can't pretend to be neutral at that kind of level. I think instead, neutrality really is a virtue for these institutions precisely because of their goods, the goals that they're seeking. Neutrality at the level of the current events, things that are happening, that an institution's job is not to weigh in on news events and tell students how to judge very complicated problems or policies. I think that level of neutrality really has to be valued, but it might also be something that students have to be reminded of. It's sometimes at this moment in which many innocent people are suffering, we need to be aware that the university is pursuing this, and we hope that our pursuit of this really helps you weigh the difficulty of these issues and defend innocent human life. So it seems to me like you could make concrete statements that defend the moral values which define the university, but do so in a way that doesn't give up the university's ability to really be a place where arguments that need to happen can happen openly.
But they need to be statements that are clear enough that they can be applied consistently. Valuing human life, that seems obvious, but it's also, there are lots of claims that can be made to that. So. Right. Anyway, I'm sorry.
Right. I mean, that could lead to a position against abortion. I mean, there are all kinds of, but I think maybe what the questioner was asking was about the Kelvin report in particular, which I personally think is a good idea. I think now university administrations, now that it's Jews that are the targets, are thinking that that's a good idea. And this is sort of why there's a phrase you may be familiar with: the Jews are the canary in the coal mine. And another way that I put it is that Jews are the test of any paradigm. I mean, you stick Jews in a paradigm and Jews don't work, the paradigm fails. And I mean, it's just, I see that. And now that we are testing this moral paradigm that has become the dominant moral narrative on campus by Jews becoming, legitimate victims of atrocities. And in order for that paradigm to work, you have to say that Jews are not victims of atrocities, that Jews perpetrated them on themselves or deserved it or whatever. And so people of good conscience are going to look at that and say, this paradigm fails. But I think that the Kelvin report does have some standards within it that would allow for a statement of support for, Jews are a tiny proportion of the world's population. If you don't understand, 0.2% of the world's population is Jewish. That means that all the Jews here in the US know somebody who knows somebody personally or in their family at minimum. It's 2 degrees of separation. I can't tell you the number of friends that I have who are now called up to service or whose family members are missing or have been killed. My phone is buzzing right now and I can tell you it's people from Israel. So it's not illegitimate for a statement to the Jewish community of the university on the day of an atrocity to say, we are horrified about the acts of terrorism that were perpetrated on Jews in Israel, Jews and others in Israel, and we are here to support the members of our community. And then, when Palestinian children are killed the next day, in a response, it's not illegitimate to say, we also cry for, and as do the Jews, by the way, we also cry for all the innocent civilians who are casualties of this war in Gaza. But it's not terrorist attacks in Gaza. right? I mean, it's just important to be clear about what we're saying. And that's not a political statement. We're crying for the deaths of people. And that, I don't think that that violates a statement of neutrality.
I do see a question in the very back there. This will be our final question. I would just add quickly, as the questioner prepares, this brings to mind something that University of Notre Dame Professor Vincent Philip Munoz said at ACTA's recent Ohio Public University Governance Symposium. In effect, higher ed institutions should not be neutral. They should be partisans of the pursuit and discovery of truth. A very interesting take on institutional neutrality there. Please.
Thank you. My name is Timona Stapleton, and I am a student at UNCG, and I am a part of the Lee Barnes Fellow. My question is, while colleges do have more leeway at restricting certain types of speech and certain types of protests to keep the campus safe, I'm wondering if the calls as a direct response to what is happening in the Middle East and regarding anti-Semitism, is it fair and can be construed as a content-based restriction? Because we're trying to change things on campus in direct response to that. And if campuses feel there is a need for that, should they make or overhaul their restrictions based on all types of protests, or focus on, Brandenburg v. Ohio is the standard, and that was a KKK leader, and so I just want to know what your thoughts are on that.
I'm not sure if I totally understand the question, so tell me if I'm getting it wrong. But I think when you say content, are you saying there are standards that are being, or I think you're raising the question about whether there are standards that are being applied unevenly and that they're sort of changing in response to a particular situation? Is that what
There are calls for changes now.
by
Discussions
by
in colleges about restricting speech, and it's being brought up again because of what's happening in the Middle East.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering.
You're asking whether there should be content-based restrictions on speech on campus.
Correct.
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. I mean, my sort of 2-second response is if there are I'm not sure how that would work. I guess as I'm thinking about it in practice, I guess I'm sort of open, but I don't know how that would work, given that whatever you would come up with as a content-based restriction would have to be applied consistently. So, I mean, it reminds me of this idea. So when I talk about certainty, one of the pieces of that is that no idea is exempt from criticism, questioning, or examination. Nothing gets a free pass. And so I'm not sure how that fits in. And I think that's a pretty foundational assumption. Now so there's more to it. I don't want to take up too much time, but there's more to it than that. But I guess I'm not sure how that would mesh with content-based. Yeah, I'd have to think about it. I don't know, it's an interesting question. It doesn't sound like something that could work to me, but.
I would say no.
There you go. She's much more concise than I am.
No.
I think there are sometimes, I guess my only concern with that is sometimes there are historical reasons why there are certain contents that might be in a particular historical context for a particular community more explosive than others. And if you get the historical context and you realize that this isn't just a proposition that was put on the table, but something else that could be seen in a different way. I'm thinking here of Thomas's dissent. I think he was the only one that dissented in that case about whether or not burning cross on the lawn was free speech. And he said it's a threat, and everyone else kind of saw it as a kind of act of free speech or something like that. I don't know the details of the case, so the lawyer can correct me, but I believe he was the only dissent, and he read it differently. It wasn't a matter of content, it was a matter of threat. And so I think there might be contextual things, and I think here of Germany, and there are content rules there about speaking about the Holocaust.
And there is a very high level of anti-Semitism. It hasn't changed it. By the way, there were laws in the Weimar Republic restricting Nazi speech, and it didn't work. And so the reason I say no, and I'm not that uncertain about it. I mean, what I am fairly certain of is that trying to use content as opposed to the limits that we currently already have, which are pretty wise. But trying to use content as a limit for speech is, I think, guaranteed to fail. I don't know that the limits that we have will work, but I think trying to censor speech will fail.
Yeah, and I think the main reason to not have them is that, you know, if a student says something stupid to me, then I can engage them in conversation, right? We can talk about reasons, we can talk about evidence, but if they're not allowed to say it and they only say it on some kind of secret online forum or they only say it to their roommates, then there's no way in which they can really be corrected, or at least it's harder for them to be corrected.
The other thing is that it leads people into conspiratorial thinking. You know, we're not allowed to say this. Why? Because it's true, you know, and so now we have to create I mean, it's just not, it's wrong for a lot of reasons, or it's ineffective for a lot of reasons. But also, you can see the immediate reaction to some of the really horrible speech that we've heard has at least highlighted what the speech is. I don't agree with all of the sort of cancellation attempts, as abhorrent as I think the speech is. But like the truck that went around to Harvard with the faces and names of the people who had signed the statements condemning Israel for the Hamas attacks on it. That was, I don't agree with that at all. It's horrible to, and also, we also have to remember that these are kids on college campuses. You know, like, what dumb thing did I do and believe when I was a kid in college that if I had to defend it now, I don't know what I would do. I don't even remember, you know, because I'm really old. But I mean, these kids are eventually going to grow up, and if we don't treat them like they can make mistakes too, and that they're human beings, and that they deserve to be listened to, even if they're saying horrible things, if we treat them like they're just monsters, then we're going to create monsters out of them.
Well, Samantha Harris will be on a roundtable discussion later this afternoon, so perhaps she can shed some more legal insight on this topic. But until then, please, everyone, join me in thanking once again our daring and wise panelists.